Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us this morning. We're just waiting for people to join, and then we'll start the session. Thank you for joining us for this Mitochondrial Muscle Matters session. Good morning to those coming through from the waiting room still. We'll start in a couple of moments' time once everyone's come through from the waiting room. Thank you for joining us. Okay, so I'll start us off. So thank you very much for joining us this morning for our Muscle Matters 2022 online seminar on mitochondrial disease. I'm Rob Burley. I'm MDUK's Director of Care, Communications and Support. We've got a very packed agenda this morning with a fantastic array of speakers, and we're going to split the session into two parts. So we'll start with a look at the latest developments around research into mitochondrial disease, and there'll be a chance to ask any questions that you might have on that topic or have a discussion with the panelists. And then after that, we'll move on to discuss living with mitochondrial disease, where we'll focus mainly on answering your questions about managing mitochondrial disease and the impact of it. We're covering as many questions as we can that have been submitted in advance, but we'll also be using the Q&A function, which you'll be able to see at the bottom of the screen. So to help us manage the technical side of the event, we won't be calling on questioners to ask their questions over the Zoom. Instead, I'll relay questions that come through in that Q&A function. So please do type in your questions or comments and I'll feed them in. Any questions we can't cover in the session, we'll endeavour to answer through our website afterwards or through our email. Before we begin, a note that our helpline is available to anyone affected by muscle wasting conditions. And so do please contact us if you have any questions or are in need of any support. We can help you with information and can either support you directly or signpost you to the best place to get the help you need. The number and email should be on the screen, I think, but you can call us on 0800 652 6352, or you can email info@musculardystrophyuk.org. And a final thank you, we'd like to thank our sponsors, PTC, who sponsored the Muscle Matters series. Thank you for their support. And a final reminder that we're recording the session and it will be made available on our website over the next few days. And you'll also be able to find recordings of all the sessions in this series, as well as recordings of previous year's sessions. So to start us off this morning, I'm delighted to hand over to my colleague, Dr. Andrea Gubus, who will introduce our research speakers and then share the first part of this morning's session. So Andrea, over to you.
Thank you, Rob. Good morning and welcome, everyone. I am delighted that we have a fantastic panel of speakers with us this morning. It is my pleasure to welcome two speakers for the research part of this session today. First, we have Professor Grainne Gorman from the Newcastle University, followed by Professor Rita Horvath from the University of Cambridge. Professor Grainne Gorman is a director of the Wellcome Center for Mitochondrial Research at Newcastle University, an internationally renowned center of excellence in mitochondrial disease. Professor Gorman qualified from the Royal College of Surgeons in Ireland, after which he completed 3 years of general medical training in Dublin, and moved to Newcastle to further her understanding of neuromuscular disease. As well as currently holding the post of the director of the Wellcome Center for Mitochondrial Research, Professor Gorman is also neuromuscular team lead at the NIHR Newcastle Biomedical Research Center, as well as the senior clinical lecturer at the Institute for Translational Clinical Research at the Newcastle University. Clinically, Professor Gorman is a consultant neurologist at the Royal Victoria Infirmary Neurosciences Centre in Newcastle, with a particular interest in neuromuscular diseases. Our second speaker for today is Professor Rita Horvath, who gained her PhD in mitochondrial disease from Budapest, Hungary. In 2007, she was appointed a lecturer at Newcastle University in the Mitochondrial Research Group, and then she became a professor of neurogenetics in Newcastle University in 2013. During her time in Newcastle, Professor Horvath developed a service for people with inherited peripheral neuropathies, such as Charcot-Marie Tooth disease. In 2018, Professor Horvath became a director of research at the Department of Clinical Neurosciences at University of Cambridge. Her research interests include understanding molecular mechanisms of rare diseases, such as mitochondrial diseases and Charcot-Marie-Tooth disease, in order to develop treatments. And before we start, as Rob said, make use of the Q&A section and write down all your questions and comments for either Professor Gorman or Professor Horvath, which we'll discuss after both of the talks. And now, without further ado, I'll hand over to Professor Gorman for her talk.
So good morning. So I'm actually going to present some different work that we've done from a research perspective, and really what we're hoping to do and what we're trying to do, particularly over the last 12 months, is to raise the profile and awareness of mitochondrial disease. And over the next 10 minutes, I'm going to take you through a little odyssey of what we've been doing, how we've been working in partnership with our charity organisations, and how actually we're trying to influence policy. Because a lot of the work that Rita will speak about is around clinical trial delivery, but we think there's also another aspect where we must influence policy, and very much around an engagement and communication campaign to increase the profile of mitochondrial disease. But that's really ultimately to increase funding. Very much after the pandemic, we think a lot of these rare diseases have been sidelined. And we think now is a time, particularly within the United Kingdom, with our expertise right across the 4 regions, that we as a collective should all come together, not just champion mitochondrial disease, but all forms of rare disease. And I think MDUK do such credit to you all. And as you'll see, they're part of this journey. So what did we want to do? Well, for those of you who are unfamiliar, mitochondrial diseases are a common genetic disorder. They can affect any age at any stage. And what we usually see is a pattern of symptoms that come together. But what we often hear patients saying is that they're tired of going into health professionals and having to, reiterate their story over and over, or people dismiss them going, I don't know what that is. And you can fully understand it's quite frustrating. And really, without raising awareness, it's going to be very difficult for us to really influence policy, as well as change the landscape of how research funding is actually allocated. And that really is the holy grail, that last part, making sure we've got equitable access to funding to really champion new discoveries in therapeutics. So what we did is we've set up this it's quite an ambitious project. We call it Project Pearl. And really it's to design an effective engagement and communication campaign to raise awareness, not just for mitochondrial disease, but all rare diseases across the entire landscape of rare disease, and really just for the benefit of all that community. So we've worked quite closely in partnership with a team in London to co-develop methodology to learn more about the public understanding of mitochondrial disease and dysfunction at a national level. So we first took focus groups with patients who knew a lot about mitochondrial disease, they themselves affected, as well as their caregivers. And what we did is we did a lot of market research. We then surveyed 1,000 of the general public, and that's perhaps where things got exceptionally interesting. Could you move forward the slide, please, for me? So you look at the first slide, and I absolutely remember where I was when this result come through to me, and I was absolutely devastated, because we think we spend our whole life, educating what's mitochondrial disease. And if you look at that first graph, only 18% of those 1,000 surveyed had even heard of mitochondrial disease, and 82% were unaware. And we tried to, break that down, what that was, awareness and unawareness. Really, the landscape for rare diseases wasn't really good among the general public. Their understanding of what defined a rare disease and what it meant to have a rare disease. So we had provided them with a few statements around, the percentage of the population are affected, a disease that medical professions know little about, a disease that's not well known, a disease that doesn't have a cure. And as you can see, really, when you look at the green bars in the lower slide, again, the awareness among the general population as a whole is really not, is not very high around rare diseases. Next slide, please. So as I say, I remember where I was, and I remember walking down the beach and an hour later walking back up the beach and thinking, this is a challenge, but disappointed on the way down, but full of enthusiasm on the way back, because we can make an effective change. Because whilst there wasn't a huge understanding of rare diseases, it really informed a strategy. We went, okay, the first thing we must do is raise awareness. The second thing is about our language, the language we use. And that was really helpful because we took quite an extensive survey to the 1,000 people. And we went about using what kind of terms you would use, like genetic disorder. We asked them, did they think genetic research was important? And we were really enthused to see that 77% said yes. So even though they didn't have a huge understanding, they thought it was important. And whilst a high percentage were unfamiliar with rare diseases, really the perception of rarity was being driven by awareness. So that told us that therefore our first priority must be to increase awareness. And that's what we've been doing ever since. So on the basis of that, we put together strategic recommendations that would increase awareness, would effectively define what mitochondrial disease was, and we would stop using the term rare because they're not rare collectively. These are common disorders. And really, the important message from all our interactions was we needed to communicate that the severity of the disease and the importance of research were intertwined. And really, without research, there would never be hope for a cure. Next slide, please. So we devised this little graph, and this is what we put to the general public. And what we wanted to know, what did they mean by rare? What was perception of rarity? And just look at where we fall on the map. So Fragile X, hemochromatosis, mitochondrial. Duchenne's isn't hugely up above us. So, you know, people understand about cystic fibrosis. And our challenge was, well, this is currently what the awareness is, and we hope to survey in a year's time and hope that we're further up that curve. Next slide, please. So our recommendations are increase awareness of mitochondrial dysfunction, not just disease, and raise its salience. It's important to define what it is, why research is important, communicate the severity of the symptoms and the role that research can play. We realize we must clearly define a goal to allow people to support our cause. And really, when we're talking about what that vision might be for the future of mitochondrial disease, that without research, there will be never hope for a cure, and that quality of life and quality of care was equally as important. Next slide, please. So how did we go about this? Well, first thing we did, started creating infographics. And any of you who are currently on our LinkedIn, our Twitter account, or Facebook will be seeing, I've been bombarded last week with these for Mitochondrial Awareness Week. But my goodness, my LinkedIn account has never stopped pinging. And people like visuals. And what we did is, again, work with patients about what were the most salient messages that we needed to get across. And really, a picture says 1,000 words, and that's what we're trying to encapsulate. Next slide, please. We then also paired with Genetic Alliance UK and ITN to take part in sharing a light on rare conditions, which you can still see on YouTube. And that really increased our metrics and awareness. As you can see, with over 9,000 reactions on Facebook and over 5,000 on Twitter. And really, before that, we were lucky to be in the hundreds. Next slide, please. Then with this campaign, it was interesting that nearly 500,000 views for the whole program were actually recorded, and therefore it shows the power of I think working along with a professional organization like ITN Productions as well as Genetic Alliance, because we had never been able to increase our profile so much or reach so many of the general population until we paired with them. Next slide, please. Then what we've also done is we paired with other organizations outside muscle or outside genetic disorders like Kidney Research UK, Epilepsy UK and Parkinson's, because mitochondrial dysfunction matters to all these other disorders. And what we're championing is mitochondrial dysfunction underlies a lot of these. And if we can find a cure for primary mitochondrial disease, look at the world that we could potentially impact. Next slide, please. And we couldn't do this without our patients. They've been absolutely amazing at telling their stories, sharing both from a patient perspective and from a carer's perspective. And really, this is what's really moved the field forward, we feel, and this is where we find the most feedback, because it's that authenticity and generosity of patients and their carers to share their story right across many of the different social channels. Next slide, please. As you can see, that we've reached out even just beyond our usual channels, and again, pushing for things like inclusive deafness. And as you see, there was just a lovely little email back from them surrounding a snapshot compilation of some of the functional impacts of hearing conditions that are very much linked to mitochondrial dysfunction. And a lot of our patients actually suffer from hearing loss that perhaps isn't the thing that's most targeted when we think about mitochondrial disease, but has a huge impact on day-to-day functioning and quality of life, and something that the Lilly Foundation is sponsoring an up-and-coming study with one of our investigators, Dr. Stefanati, to look at a device to improve hearing. Next slide, please. And really, without just going to the general population, we must affect change among healthcare professionals and among academics. And therefore, we've been going to every conference possible. And we really do have to say thank you to MDUK for including us in their April brochure. And as you can see, we're trying to infiltrate every conference there is, not just within the United Kingdom, but globally. Next slide, please. We're also making our way to the politicians. Really important to get ourselves into Parliament. We were supposed to be in Parliament last week, but with the sad death of the Queen, we put all that on hold. But watch out, because we're going to be coming back before Christmas, going to Parliament to champion, to increase awareness, not just around mitochondrial disease, but rare diseases as a whole. And our local MP, Liz Twist, has been exceptionally helpful in hosting us for a day. So watch on the platforms, because we are asking people to reach out to the politicians and ask them to drop in to raise awareness. Next slide, please. We're not only reaching out to politicians, but we're looking for other inventive ways of how to fund the research. And again, you'll see this across a lot of the mediums. But last slide, please. But really, in conclusion, we really can't do this without you all. And what was really lovely was last week, honestly, the Twitter page was opened all day next door, and we had a little student, and I think that I thought all I did was on Twitter all day, but we were just watching. And what was really powerful, how global world network of charities come together to take over. And some of the feedback has been absolutely amazing. And as I say, even right this morning, early hours of this morning, LinkedIn hasn't started. So I think together and collectively, we can really move the dial and increase awareness, not just around mitochondrial disease, but rare diseases. And I've always this thing, if we work together, we'll get there quicker. And that's certainly what we have seen over the last 12 months. So hopefully I've taken you on a whistle-stop tour of what we're currently doing to raise awareness of rare disease, and also to influence policy and the funding landscape for these vital diseases, to ensure we can find more equitable ways of accessing treatment and potential cures, as well as improving quality of life. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Gorman. That was a really great talk. I would like to hand over to Professor Horvath now, and then we can continue the discussion afterwards, after the talk.
Yes, good morning. I am trying to share my slides. Do you see it? Okay, Thank you.
Yes.
So after this very interesting presentation of Dr. Gorman, I will talk about a slightly different project. This is called the so-called treatabolome project. And in this project, over the last few years, we were trying to identify some targeted therapies for rare neuromuscular diseases, including Leigh syndrome as well. So I work at the Department of Clinical Neurosciences at the University of Cambridge, and here I see patients, but I also have a molecular lab where we work on in vitro cellular models derived from patient cells, and also zebrafish models of mitochondrial disease, and we study molecular mechanisms to understand how we could improve the symptoms of the disease of the patients. So we have a quite complex research program, but today I will focus on a more recent project about identifying treatable variants in mitochondrial disease. So the genetic diagnosis of mitochondrial diseases have changed rapidly over the last 10 years, since we are doing whole exome sequencing or whole genome sequencing in many of the patients. And we also can identify a much higher number of patients with the certain genetic forms of mitochondrial disease, what we have done previously in a cohort of mitochondrial disease patients with multiple respiratory chain deficiency. And in the UK, over the past few years, the whole genome sequencing has been implemented into the diagnosis of rare disease patients, and particularly in mitochondrial disease. Katrin Schoen, a geneticist in Cambridge with many colleagues all over the UK, looked into the genome sequencing data of these patients. And after the exclusion of some common genetic causes of mitochondrial disease, with this whole genome sequencing, we identified a definite or probable diagnosis in 31% of the patients, and another 2% had a possible diagnosis. But what was very interesting, that 62.5% of the families with a new diagnosis had a non-mitochondrial disease. And this is highlighting very much that even if we think that the patient has a suspected mitochondrial disease, it is often not the case, because there is a lot of overlap in the clinical presentation of mitochondrial disease with other rare genetic diseases. And in this diagnostic process, we also identified a few new treatable disorders. So many patients nowadays who is suspected to have a mitochondrial disease have a whole exome or whole genome sequencing, but it's still not that easy to identify the causative variant, because even in one exome of almost everybody, there are approximately 25 to 50,000 variants, which are different from the reference sequence. And it's not always very easy to pinpoint which one is the pathogenic mutation. So if we put the sample in the sequencer, first we have to do a lot of bioinformatic evaluation of the variants. Then we can predict whether it can cause a defect. We have to look at population frequency data, because there are some variants which are very frequent in the normal population that they cannot cause disease. And also often we have to study in vitro cellular models or animal models to prove that the variant is actually pathogenic. But nowadays, all these processes have improved significantly. This was illustrated in a recent project, what we have performed in collaboration with Semra Hiz and Yavuz Oktay in Izmir, Turkey, where we were performing so-called trio exome sequencing, which means that they sequenced the patient, but also both parents. And we only included consanguineous families into the study with pediatric neurogenetic disease. And in this cohort, we could identify the diagnosis in 86% of the patients, which is a very high rate. And it illustrates very well that our technology is improving a lot. And 10% of actually these patients with a genetic diagnosis there was something what we could medication what we could give to the patient, or change of treatment. So actually, it is worth identifying the cause of rare disease, because about 10% of the cases, the management of the patients can be changed. And from one of these patients, we made a video with the Genetic Alliance for Rare Disease, what you can watch later. So in this project, we used the so-called RD Connect platform. So this is a bioinformatic platform where we upload genetic and phenotypic data of the patients. So first, the clinician who sees the patient is filling in the clinical information on the patient in a kind of computerized way, in a so-called form of HPO terms. And this clinical information is going to the RD Connect platform. And the sample, the biosample, is being sequenced, and the sequencing data also join the phenotypic data within the RD Connect platform. And in this platform, both the bioinformatics team and also the clinicians themselves can analyze their patients' data. And in this platform, there are also many aspects of the consenting and data sharing are solved. So this is very available for large international projects. In this database, there are more than 20,000 genome-phenome data sets. There are over 62,000 biosamples, over 112 rare disease, and 382 patient registries. So it has a lot of additional information available. And in this treatabolome project, we were trying to flag potentially treatable variants at the time of the diagnosis. So you all know that diagnosing rare diseases has been very difficult before the better sequencing technologies. And the diagnostic odyssey of a rare disease patient was about 4.5 years. And now we can identify the molecular cause, but it still takes a lot of time till these patients get the treatment which is available for them. Because based on the genetic variants, then some patients with a particular causative variants have a therapy available to them. There are some patients with a particular variant who can be harmed if they receive a particular drug. And also some patients with a particular variant are of increased risk of developing some symptoms. So actually, there are many important information are relevant based on the genetic result, but because the clinicians cannot just know all this information, so it may take a lot of time till this important information reaches the patient and the clinician who is treating the patient. So therefore, we decided to set up a database where we can immediately highlight the variants which are treatable. So this is what you can see. This is a patient's exome data and a list of potentially causative variants. And we want to manage that immediately when the variant is being filtered, that we can have a small box. If it is a treatable variant, we would immediately detect it. And this would bring us to a link of the publication which is reporting on the treatment. So that was the basis of a project called the treatabolome, which is a part of a large European rare disease genomic project called Solvardi. Giselle Bon and Antonio Atalaya are in Paris, and they were leading on this work package in this project, and they were initiating and organizing that these treatabolome data sets are being collected and published for many rare neuromuscular diseases. So the first step in writing the treatabolome is to do a systematic review of the literature, and we have to extract the data on disease genes and variants which are treatable. And this data set is in the next step reviewed by an expert clinician who has a lot of experience with this rare disease. And then we use a database by using some computer-friendly ontologies. So we turn the clinical phenotype of the patient in so-called computer-readable HPO terms, which include numbers. And also, when we set up this database, we are aiming to make it releasable. We release it and reusable for others. So this is what we have done in Lee syndrome. So Mei Jung-Tiet is a clinical PhD fellow who has done most of the work. So first of all, she did a systematic review of the literature where she identified 1,193 articles which are mentioning some kind of treatment for Lee syndrome. Then she analyzed the articles according to our criteria, and actually only 104 articles met the inclusion criteria, and these were further analyzed for the evidence base of the study, because there were some case reports, but there were also some clinical trials in this database. So we used many different databases for our search, and we only included papers which were on genetically confirmed Lee syndrome, and the patients also had a confirmed mutation which was affecting the mitochondrial oxidative phosphorylation. And also only papers where there was a variant or gene-specific treatment. So based on this search, we have identified several compounds which were tested or reported to be beneficial in different forms of Lee syndrome. And this is quite a complicated picture, but what you can see, the numbers in these small colorful circles are the number of papers which we found on the certain disease with a certain medication, and that the score is this in the 4-5 in the one graph and the 0 in the other graph. It only means that these studies were not very high quality studies. So most of these studies were actually case studies on a few patients with a rare mitochondrial disease. So we cannot really say that in this syndrome there were too many double-blind clinical trials performed to date. However, because there are some very specific biochemical defects which can cause this syndrome, even if we do not do a clinical trial, in some diseases like coenzyme Q10 biosynthesis defects or some biotin thiamine responsive basal ganglia disease, there is a treatment available for the patients even without high evidence of trials in a clinical trial. And this is worth highlighting to help that these patients receive this treatment as soon as possible. So we have also done a similar approach in Charcot-Marie-Tooth disease with a PhD student and a medical student previously, and also identified some potentially treatable variants and genes. And in summary, so we can say, based on the study, that the interventional trials have begun for mitochondrial disease, and there were very few available for Leigh disease. However, the majority of evidence remains in case reports and case series, but because some of these defects are very specific biochemical defects, in these diseases, clinical trials may not be required for all intervention, but it is only relevant for the small group of patients with a very specific metabolic disease. And development of measurable outcomes in clinical trials is vital. And then this database is alive, and you can log into the database and you can see that there are data sets available for not only for Leigh syndrome and Charcot-Marie-Tooth disease, but also some other forms of neuromuscular diseases. And I would like to thank and introduce you our clinical research team in Cambridge, and also my laboratory research team and my founders, and I am happy to answer your questions.
Thank you so much, Professor Horvath. These were two really amazing talks, and it was actually really great to see how they kind of build on each other, with Professor Gorman talking about how important it is to raise the awareness in order to gain funding so that we can actually get to where Professor Horvath was talking about, and all these incredible scientific approaches that we can get treatments for mitochondrial diseases. Yeah, I would like to open the discussion now, and we have one question that's been written to us in advance. In case any of the listeners have any questions, please do write them in Q&A. We have around 20 minutes for the discussion if there are questions. So yes, the first question, actually, I guess either of you can answer, because it's probably more about clinical approaches, like meeting scientific approach. So one of our supporters asked, said that their son had a muscle biopsy done 3 years ago, and that the results were not conclusive, but he was diagnosed with probable mitochondrial disease. And it was recommended that the RNA sequencing to be done, which would suggest that there should be another muscle biopsy done in order to have RNA sequencing. But their son was in too much distress after the biopsy, because we know it's quite an invasive approach. So I guess their question is, how far are we from performing RNA sequencing that can be done in less invasive way?
I don't know whether I can start, and then I can give it over to Grainne. So in this case, if there was a first biopsy done, so it would have been possible, if there is still muscle available from the first biopsy, I guess, to do the RNA sequencing. So I assume that maybe that was not the case, so it was used up. But if there is one muscle biopsy, it's always, I think, an important point to keep the material safe and in minus 80 or in very, very cold temperature, that it can be used for future studies if the diagnosis is not found and it's not easy to interpret. But on the other hand, there is also studies which show that I know in mitochondrial disease, often the muscle is a better tissue because the muscle is more expressing the defect, but fibroblasts can be also useful to study RNA sequencing, and this can be also beneficial. So at least some big research papers showed that RNA sequencing on fibroblasts also resulted in an extra 10–15% of genetic diagnosis, and taking fibroblasts is less invasive than a muscle biopsy. And currently there is also research ongoing in the NIHR bioresource, the so-called RNA phenotyping project, which is trying to collect now RNA blood samples from patients with mitochondrial disease, and we are trying to see whether is there anything in the blood in the RNA sequencing what can help further to diagnose the patient, but also to advise about other aspects of the disease.
Professor Gorman, do you have anything to add to that?
No, I think Rita's eloquently covered all the aspects, and I think it is back to, we can't answer individual points because I'm sure there's also been other genetic testing done, but also from around that, I think signposting to less invasive way of sampling is really important, particularly if his son was distressed. So skin biopsy is minimally invasive. And as Rita's saying, the other thing I had thought about was the NIHR route as well. So worth going back to speak to their specialist about exploring those other options.
Then I guess I have a question that builds up on this. What would there be any, and I assume probably there would there be specific like differences, maybe, yeah, I guess how specific and how accurate the result would be if we're comparing muscle biopsy to skin biopsy? I assume there would be some differences. And that's why muscle biopsy is probably preferred, right?
I think muscle is always the gold standard because it's what we've used for so long and the most accurate. But I think there, you know, if you, I suppose, you know, if you look where we were even, I was going to say 10 years ago, but if you look where we even were 5 years ago, if we just look at the whole landscape, how new technology, how new ways of investigating whole exome now, whole genome now becoming available on the NHS, I think really what we'll start to see is you know, you'll see the efficacy and the you know, that standardization, it will improve over time as we get better at technology and techniques. I think a lot of it is because muscle is always the gold standard, but I'm sure Rita's the same as us. That would not be the first person that you know, they are invasive. It is difficult the younger the person is, you know, even in an adult, it's quite a procedure. So we're pushing technology as fast as we can, as hard as we can, to try and reduce the investigative nature of testing and to improve the readouts from the other methods.
Thank you. Thank you so much. There we have another question. So let me just, okay. So about Professor Gorman's talk, actually, but I guess this question can be for either one of you. So the information on public awareness of mitochondrial diseases, that's what you talked about. And the question is, what is the awareness like within the research community? And is there an active community of scientists and researchers? And how more of them can be encouraged to explore the condition?
So that's a really good question, and respectfully, I went to the general public as a surrogate of the general field from clinical, because respectfully, you know, it's, as we say, you know, there's no use preaching to the converted, as one of my colleagues keeps saying. So the truth is, I suspect awareness isn't as good as we had hoped. And I think it's quite reflective on what we'd see on a day-to-day basis of calls we get from our clinical colleagues. So respectfully, I think what we're seeing from the general public is probably a good reflection. And I think that's why we are really going to champion on the front, as I said, is policy change, but something else because of the time constraints of the allocated time slot. I didn't speak about all the other ways we're trying to increase awareness around among researchers and clinicians. So the reason we're going with Liz Twist is also around the rare disease framework, where part of that is clinical translation and access to services. So to see if we can champion more and how we can improve that access for patients. And the second thing is using innovative ways of teaching the community, to trying to bring the wider community. So for example, we partnered with Canada to run a study day for clinicians right across allied health professionals to teach them about mitochondrial disease. And we did an unusual thing in that, you know, it wasn't where, you know, the doctor says, you know, just tell me about this, and we specifically target the questions. We had the voice of a patient and their care and their lived experience of the disease, and led the conversation more that way. We had about 75 professionals on the call, which is the largest we would ever have. And it was really lovely to see some of the comments back, you know, someone who was 20 years in the medical profession suggesting they would change their practice. So little baby steps, but we are also trying to champion that as well. But I would suggest what we saw in the general public is perhaps reflective of right across the general landscape of medics.
Thank you so much. And while we are on this topic, I just have a quick follow-up question. You obviously mentioned, and we all know this, how important it is, the funding, and it is intertwined with the awareness as well. What is the connection? Like, is there a proportional, like, what is the ratio of funding and the awareness? Like, does it rise proportionally, or do we still need to work on this? And how can we bring in more funding?
I don't know if Rita likes to comment on this, but yeah, so what was really lovely, what come across is that whilst it was perceived, when it's perceived as rare, it's not that it's not, you know, deserving, but it's not on the priority list. So that was really fascinating what we saw. So that perception of rareness meant because they were thinking of all the other things that may be prioritized. So absolutely, we need to work on this. We need to think about the language we use when we promote these conditions, when we look as a collective together, which really is what they are. You know, neuromuscular diseases are not rare when you look at them all collectively as groups. And, you know, when you think about cystic fibrosis, for example, is one of the conditions, or dare I say hemochromatosis, which is extremely prevalent. It was good to see it was less recognized, but when you see how recognized CF is, it is about awareness. It's championing the condition, and we just need to be careful of how we're actually communicating these conditions, because yes, rarity was perceived as, it's not that it wasn't deserving, but it wasn't deserving as much as those more conditions that people were more aware of. And therefore we were saying, okay, there is a lot more to be done to raise awareness and try and get equitable access to that funding. And I think very much post-COVID, I strongly feel that a lot of our patients across the rare disease forum were sidelined for COVID. I'm sure, like a lot of us, you know, who were redeployed or come back, our footprint within clinical trials was very much stopped. You know, and I understand that was appropriate at the time. We took a back step to allow vaccination development, but actually we're even really slow to restart again. And it would be, you know, for myself, and don't know how you feel, Rita, but I almost feel we've been put back at least 5 or 10 years of development of trials, that 2-year gap, and we need to get it back. We need investment to get back the 2 years that probably translate to 5 or 10 years backstop in discovery medicine, and try and catch up again with appropriate investment.
Yeah, I agree completely with Grainne's comment, and I think in general that it's difficult to say how much percentage of the funding is going for mitochondrial disease, because there is different funding sources, different funding schemes, and it also there is for primary mitochondrial disease there are grants, but there are also the role of studying basic science aspects of mitochondria, and I think in the research granting agencies, I have the feeling that still we could get grants on mitochondrial disease, so it's not handled like it's a extremely rare disease, and so it's still the relatively good proportion of grants on mitochondrial disease is still interesting. So it's not the fact that we do not have enough grants, but I agree with Grainne completely that particularly the clinical research was very much put behind now due to COVID and the trials. We have to change the strategy to do remote assessments and some kind of change our whole culture, how to do clinical research. So that needs some more time. But in general, I think the funding is, so if we are keeping up doing interesting research, hopefully the funding is coming. And also very important to raise the awareness of mitochondrial disease, also to improve the funding chances.
And I would also say challenge high. So what we're going to champion first, challenge high funding, the whole modeling of funding. You know, we need to collaborate more. The current structure of funding is competitive, and I think we need to relook at that landscape and really encourage and nudges to collaborate more, because we'll get there quicker.
Thank you. And there's another follow-up question actually on this topic in the Q&A, where Kate Williams says that Mito was on Coronation Street, which helped raising the awareness. Do you think that celebrities would help in raising the awareness, given their following and like across the globe, actually?
Yeah, I think that's really good. Whoever's raised that, yeah, it was on Coronation Street, and it sort of petered off. I think if we look at, you know, some of the things, you know, the Ice Bucket Challenge, M&D with rugby players, actually having that awareness, absolutely, it does help. but I wouldn't also neglect the kind of collective voice we all have. You know, right throughout the globe, if we all come together, that we can raise awareness. But absolutely, whoever's raised that, it's a really valid point, because it definitely does. Because that awareness is awareness that we perhaps could never get. So absolutely agree. If there's a celebrity, it definitely helps. But until we get that, I think our collective voice is also very powerful.
No, I agree completely that it helps to have some celebrities. Also in the US, there is the United Mitochondrial Disease Foundation, and on some of the meetings, Jack Black was coming along, and then they made a small movie also. So all these things were actually probably raising awareness for mitochondrial disease also in the public a bit more. So I think it is very, very good to include celebrities.
And I also think tapping into mitochondrial dysfunction in Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, epilepsy, you know, that really will, you know, when people understand that this underlies a lot of more common disorders, and we find a cure for this, we could really crack it for dementia. Some of those really big conditions that as a collective nation are hitting us all, be it dementia, cancer, aging, metabolic syndromes, diabetes. So I think, you know, there's that added value on leveraging that. We've spotted that as we have championed that, that's also been a good way of raising awareness.
Thank you. Another question we had also in Q&A about sharing this recording with other mito centers, which is something that we aim to do. I guess the question is, how do you collaborate between centers usually?
I suppose I'll start with the clinical, Rita, if you want to do the research. So actually Oxford, London and Newcastle are part of the highly specialized services for mitochondrial disease for the whole of the United Kingdom. So the three centres work together for the delivery of clinical service. So there's a lot of interaction between all centres around the clinical care and delivery. Because of the structure within the NHS, we have regular meetings, we share good practice. COVID certainly taught us that. We're on the online mostly every day with uploading guidelines and that, but yeah, we work very closely across the UK for the delivery of the clinical service. Research wise, Rita, would you like to comment? Because we equally do our best.
Yeah, research wise, there are a few research centers in the UK, like the Wellcome Center for Mitochondrial Research in Newcastle. And there is the Mitochondrial Biology Unit, which is funded by the MRC in Cambridge. And in the past, actually, we had some joint retreats between the two centers when it was to enforce collaborations or joint projects. And also there are, in the UK, the research is a bit more variable. So there are also many other centers where there are smaller research groups who are doing mitochondrial research. And what we try to do, there are some special mitochondrial research conferences, and they are not necessarily only in the UK, but they could be in Europe or internationally. And the mitochondrial research community actually knows each other very well internationally, because it's such a disease group where somehow when mitochondrial diseases were discovered in 1988, and from the beginning, there was a core group of researchers who started to have meetings. The first meeting was the EuroMeet meeting, which is still happening every 3 years. And there are several mitochondrial meetings, so we know each other very well all over the world. And there is also a new mitochondrial society, which is just being formed, a European Mitochondrial Society, which is also trying to connect scientists and clinicians to work on mitochondrial disease. So actually the community, there is a big community of mitochondrial research internationally, and there is a lot of collaboration and interaction across it. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you both for this. And I think we have probably time for another question. So the question might also involve Nick Emery, who is here with us. So he's a physio. And so the question is, how do scientists and clinicians like Professor Horvath, Professor Gorman, collaborate with professionals such as physiotherapists when it comes to conducting research? And so we haven't introduced Nick properly yet, but if you can, I would really welcome your perspective on this.
Shall I go first, and then we'll see where we go. So I think the most important thing, I think, as Rita and Professor Gorman said, that one of the fundamentals is actually getting the outcome measures right. And if we can get the outcome measures right, then we can prove that the research or the pharmaceutical interventions are working. If we don't get the outcome measures right, then we can never say categorically whether the interventions are working. So from my point of view, outcome measures are fundamental, but the other aspect is that as soon as we get some research, or as soon as we get some medication that possibly will work, it's recruiting a sufficient number of patients to be able to then investigate whether that medication is actually beneficial, and then standardizing the outcomes and collecting data carefully. If we don't collect the data carefully, like they say, rubbish in, rubbish out, and we've got to make sure that we are very, very accurate in measuring what we intend to determine.
Thank you. Anything to add, Professor Horvath, Professor Gorman?
Yeah, I like Nick's expression, like rubbish in, rubbish out. Absolutely agree. What's really lovely across the United Kingdom, particularly, they're very much champion guidelines, particularly our physiotherapists. So we work seamlessly together. They deliver the research as well as the clinical care, and all the physios have just re-looked at the guidelines for physiotherapy provision for mitochondrial disease throughout the United Kingdom. And it's really lovely sharing expertise across the different centres, both from a research and a clinical delivery perspective. So addressing the question, yes, they work very closely together. And as Nick said, really, they're paramount to everything we do. All the allied health professional, the nurse specialists, we have consultant nurses, consultant nurse specialists, exercise physiologists, dietitians, speech and language therapists. I hope I don't leave anybody out, but the full are really vital to the holistic care of patients. And I'm very clear, everyone has their role to play, and everyone is equally as important, because these are multi-system disorders. And really, if we, for example, we say, well, exercise is a good treatment, but you'd never look at isolation without looking at the diet. And quite often they've got dietary problems, dietary repletion, gut dysmotility. From a physiotherapist, from muscle weakness to fatigue, and how you modulate your activity. And a lot of this is championed actually by our allied health professionals. So we work very closely, and it really, truly is a team effort.
Yeah, I agree fully. And also both in the management of patients is very important, and keeping them in a healthy lifestyle, and also in the clinical trials, the rigorous outcome measures are very important. And this one, the physiotherapists are very crucial.
Okay, well, thank you everyone so much. With this, I will conclude the research part of this seminar today. I would thank both Professor Horvath and Professor Gorman for their wonderful talks and for a really fruitful discussion. I would also like to thank Nick for jumping in, and we'll hear more from you, I am sure, in the next hour. I'm handing it now to Rob, who will continue with the Living Well session. Thank you, everyone, again.
Thank you, Andrea. And yes, thanks very much to Professor Horvath and Professor Gorman. And yeah, thanks, Nick. We kept you on your toes there with an early question. So thank you very much. So yeah, now we're going to move the discussion on a little bit in terms of living with mitochondrial disease. And I'm delighted to welcome two more speakers, one of whom we've heard from already. We may be joined by a third, and if they are, I'll introduce them when they join us. So I'll introduce Nick first, because we've heard from already. So as you've probably gathered, Nick is a neuromuscular clinical specialist physiotherapist based at the Robert Jones and Agnes Hunt Orthopaedic Hospital in Oswestry. Nick has been a physiotherapist since 2005, and before that was a firefighter. And he spent his entire physio career in neuromuscular disease. He works with a sort of a really sort of good team at the Agnes Hunt Centre, and he also runs independent physio clinics and provides advice and care for musculoskeletal pain in neuromuscular disease, and also provides exercise advice. And as we heard, he's also involved in research projects. And I'm also very pleased that we're joined by Natalie James, who's a specialist nurse for the mitochondrial service and has been since 2014, and also supports patients with rare muscle channel disease. Prior to that, she worked and supported with neuromuscular patients as a specialist nurse since 2009, and has worked in neurology since 1995, so has a lot of experience in this area. Nick, because we've heard from you already, I'll bring you in first, that's okay. And just as well as helping with those research measures, which I thought was really fascinating, can you just explain a bit about why physiotherapy is so important to someone living with mitochondrial disease, and the kind of support that you and the team provide?
Yeah, I'm always going to start backwards. I think, usual, controversial. I think that lots of the disease, I'm going to start generally, lots of the diseases we deal with are sort of a hidden problem. And so people might not necessarily know that a person has mitochondrial disease or whatever. And so that person lives with that stigma in a way, and they often have to explain themselves continually. And I think that's really difficult to do from a psychological point of view. And also from a social point of view, because the mitochondrial disease affects that energy production. Their world often gets a little bit smaller as they run out of energy, as they become a little bit more fatigued. So they're less likely to go out, less likely to engage in society. And I think from the physiotherapy point of view, then, our role is to manage that, not only from sort of a physical point of view, you can do this exercise, you can do that, but also from that psychosocial aspect as well, that managing the condition involves a lot of them taking a little bit more responsibility on pacing. We often see that patients they'll have a good day and they'll do far too much on that good day, and then they'll have 4 or 5 days when they'll be absolutely exhausted and not be able to do so much, and that has a knock-on effect for them psychologically. I'm getting worse. The other aspect is that because the mitochondria are expressed in all the tissues of the body, that the brain is extremely greedy in terms of energy. So even just on tick over doing nothing, it's extremely greedy. As soon as you start to introduce some cognitive load onto that, it becomes more fatiguing. So you often hear patients saying, I feel brain fog, or I've got this. So that impacts on their ability to be able to do work, and that has a massive effect on them. And then the other aspect I see quite a lot of is pain. I see a lot of patients with mitochondrial disease who have widespread, unremitting pain that just is there. It's background, it's a background ache. They really struggle with sleep. They really struggle with just normal days that we would take for granted. And again, that's that psychological impact. I'm getting worse. So it's tricky. It is difficult. And I think that physiotherapy, psychology, clinical nurse specialists all play a role in trying to manage that as well as the clinicians. It is about pacing. It's about doing a little bit of exercise, but it's about doing manageable amounts of exercise, not pushing yourself too hard. And that's really difficult to try and get across. And how much is enough, we don't know. There's quite a lot of research done. I know that a lot was done by Doug Turnbull up in Newcastle about the fact that doing a little bit of exercise can be beneficial because it does upregulate mitochondria. But if you do too much, that's detrimental. In normal tissue, we can do lots of exercise, get lots of mitochondria produced, we can produce lots of energy. If you've got the genetic condition where you can't upregulate that mitochondria, you're on a bit of a sticky wicket. So that's my take on just the basics.
Thanks, Nick. That's great. And Natalie, sort of Nick mentioned your role within the group of people there that support people living with mitochondrial disease. So could you explain a bit about the specialist nurse role and how you support patients working with living with the condition?
Absolutely. Yeah, thanks, Nick. You're right. It is quite often really challenging for patients because it is hidden unless you've got an obvious facial eyelid droop, or you maybe got the patients who've got myoclonic jerks, or patients who've got severe mobility problems. So the hidden disability aspect is an enormous part of what I support patients with, in terms of trying to get them to find ways that they can express what their condition does and how it affects them to their employers, to their college, to their friends, particularly with the young people, trying to support them to maintain their friendship groups, because Nick's right, their world gets very, very small very quickly. And it's so important that they keep those social networks going. So if they can explain to friends, you know what, actually my energy levels are really low today, I'll come out, but I'm not going to stay out for long. And it's trying to empower patients to express and find the right words. And Professor Gorman was, it's about how you phrase things. It's very difficult for patients to express what mitochondrial disease is to other people that don't get it. So part of my role is helping them find a way for them to express it. I do a lot of symptom management. So people will ring me and say, I'm a little bit concerned about these symptoms. I'm not sure if it's directly related to my mitochondrial disease. I'll then signpost them back to the team, or to the GP, or to local services. I do a lot of on the ward education with staff and students. I support carers and carer networks. I've done a lot of work with social services and allied health professionals in the community to try and help them understand how complex the particular client that they're working with is, and things that they can look out for to support that person. But Nick's right, it's also about helping people try and be a bit more self-directed and managing themselves, because actually they're the ones that are living with the mitochondrial disease. They're the experts in how their energy is, and pacing is so important. So trying to find a way to get them to understand how much of their energy they can, so thinking about a bank account and how much money you've got, and you have to budget your money over the month. You can't spend it all in the first couple of days because you'll have nothing. So it's the same with energy. So using that analogy, patients find that quite easy. I do a lot of unfortunately linking with hospitals when patients are admitted to district general hospitals, and it goes back to that question about educating and awareness to the wider healthcare sector, that actually the problems that these patients have been admitted with may or may not be related to their mitochondrial disease, but if in the case of some patients it directly is, how do they best manage that patient? So there's a lot of that rescue care and things, and then collaborating with the other nurses across the country.
Thank you very much. You've both alluded, you both mentioned fatigue and pacing. I think that's a really useful analogy, Natalie, about thinking about like a bank account. So a quick plug in that we've worked this year with a range of care advisors and others, including nurse specialists, to produce some fatigue guidelines that people can find on our website. They're not only relevant to mitochondria, they're sort of relevant across the piece. So do take a look. But I think pacing is covered in there because that is a really important aspect. All the speakers this morning have spoken about awareness within various different spheres, and actually I was going to come to you both. We had a question around awareness amongst GPs. So presumably by the time you see someone with mitochondrial disease, they've probably gone and presented a symptom to a GP in the first instance, or through another route. So how long has someone's journey been usually before they come to you with a diagnosis? And the second part of the question would be, how do you work with non-specialist professionals to help raise awareness? And is there a route for sort of more work in that area? I always like the stunned silence. Nick, I'll go to you first, just because you're grinning.
Right. Yeah, I think although whatever, it is a rare disease, and if a person turns up at a GP practice, especially if they're later in a diagnosis, then the GP may put it down to an age-related, oh, you're getting a little bit older, so don't worry about it. And then if they do, we find they normally go through rheumatology first, and then rheumatology will do a number of tests, and then eventually they will end up in their specialist centre. And then used to be the diagnosis to getting to the point of you've got this or you haven't got this used to be quite a long, drawn out process. Now it's a lot quicker with whole genome sequencing, next generation sequencing, but there's still a lot of patients who present with a mitochondrial type symptoms who don't get a diagnosis of mitochondrial disease, and that leaves them in a bit of limbo land, and I don't think that's particularly, we can't help it, it's just we're going to get better at it, but it does. I mean, I think about 20% of our patients don't have a diagnosis, but they have all the symptoms. So they have fatigability, they have, and the biopsies are non-specific. There might be, there might not. And that leaves patients quite distraught. But I think that we did try and run a sort of an education day for GPs to try and bring up awareness, but it wasn't really well taken up, and I don't know why. I think it's they're busy, they haven't got the time, and as I say, they're incredibly rare diseases, so the GPs won't be aware of all the neuromuscular diseases. So their role is signposting, but if they're not too sure your service exists, then they might not know to send you there. Rheumatology is far more well known, so they'll probably go down the rheumatology route. The rheumatologist generally will do their tests and then eventually run out. Whether they discharge them at that point or not, I don't know, but I'd hope that they would refer on to a specialist centre. And that's the other thing that I would really emphasise. If patients with a mitochondrial condition aren't under a specialist centre, then they really need to be under a specialist centre to get the care they need.
Brilliant, thanks, Nick. And yeah, same question to you, Natalie. And I wonder also, we had an advanced question actually just about what are the kind of symptoms that someone with mitochondrial might have. So if you wouldn't mind just sort of just explaining, Nick's already explained some of the symptoms, but anything else that might show up for someone, and then the question around how people have found their way to you.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, in our centre, we've got a large percentage of patients, or a good percentage of patients, who still don't have a genetic or molecular diagnosis. And that may be just because we just don't know the genes are there, we just haven't found them. So that's why research is so important. And particularly with new techniques like mRNA sequencing and the newer whole genome sequencing, that is going to open up a whole load of diagnoses. These patients will get a diagnosis. It may take a while. So some patients will have a very long journey to get to a diagnosis of mitochondrial disease, and it may be that they have symptoms that may be common. So diabetes is common in the general population. Hearing impairment could be quite common in the general population, particularly in the older age group. Hearing impairment in a younger person is a bit of a red flag. But other symptoms, you might have some GI disturbance, they might have some slow digestive transits, they may have short stature, they may have failure to thrive. You might get some ocular symptoms, so maybe the patients might notice that they get a bit of double vision, but that goes away. Then it becomes more persistent. So we get quite a lot of referrals in our centre through Moorfields Hospital. So Moorfields will see somebody with double vision, difficulty moving their eyes, or a drooping eyelid, and they'll have a look and they'll go, actually, we've ruled out the common things like myasthenia, and think, well, could this be a mitochondrial disease? Let's refer to the mitochondrial team and get patients diagnosed that way. In terms of patients presenting to GPs, obviously, if somebody turns up at a GP and they've got diabetes, and they've got deafness, and they might have a bit of GI problems, the GP is not necessarily going to connect those dots to think, could this be a mitochondrial condition? Obviously, we're trying to raise that awareness with GPs through articles, literature, social media, GP education training modules, those sorts of things. But it's quite often once the patient's got a diagnosis, or if they've been to a local neurologist and then they come to us, we will then link with that GP and either through their letters explain what mitochondrial disease is. Whether the GPs have time to read the letters, that remains to be seen. But quite often what we'll do, particularly with our complex patients, is that there will be a time that we'll quite often ring the GP and have a chat with the GP about that particular patient and say, this person's just had a diagnosis of mitochondrial disease. They've had it all their lives, really. It's different when you've got when there's a clear maternal line, when there's clear family history, and the GP will go, oh, well, look, your mum, your sisters, your aunties, your grandmother have all had it. This could be something maternally inherited. Oh, let's think, could it be mitochondrial disease? And then they've referred to neurology. So that's kind of that pathway. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, no, definitely. That's really helpful. Thank you. And just something you said was really interesting in terms of by the time someone receives a diagnosis, they've had several. They may have had it for a lifetime and had symptoms. What is there a psychological aspect to sort of suddenly finding out that actually all those symptoms are potentially linked to one condition, and you now have a name for it? Do people feel? How does that affect people?
Yeah, I mean, obviously having multiple symptoms where people don't believe you, where you felt that you're not being listened to. There's a huge sense of frustration because you can't get or access the support that you need either at work or in the community or from social care or whatever. So there's an element of frustration, and it can have a huge psychological impact not having a diagnosis. And then obviously we prepare patients by saying, we're going to investigate that this may be a mitochondrial cause. We explain what mitochondrial disease is, umbrella term, multi-system, etc., different genetic causes. And then when they do get their diagnosis, we'll bring them back into clinic and we'll sit down and say, well, this is what it means. It does, obviously we'll continue to support each system appropriately because that's all we can do. So cardiology will look after heart, audiovestibular will look after their bit. So they'll be under multiple people depending on what organ systems are involved, but we'll have that sort of overarching linking point. And sometimes for some patients, having a diagnosis can be a huge relief because they can actually say, phew, it's not all in my head. I have got something that unifies all these symptoms. And then they find it easier to access care. For other patients, getting a diagnosis can be quite devastating, actually. And it, the implications of it, am I going to be able to have kids? And we go down that route, insurance, all the other implications. Some people don't deal well with it. So having psychology to come in and support patients is enormous. But funding for specialist psychology is, trying to get access to that is a big issue, and I think there is a lack of that across the board. So yeah, it will have a huge impact psychologically.
Thank you. Yeah, I think presumably for some people, having the diagnosis empowers them, as you talked about, empowering patients to have those conversations with employers and colleges. So I guess for some people that becomes something that helps them to explain it, but yeah, for others it's a bit of a shock. And you're absolutely right about the lack of psychological provision. So something MDUK is keen to work harder on is growing that workforce and also supporting roles like care advisors to be able to help people with sort of mental health needs as well, because it's definitely an increasing issue.
Absolutely, and it's not just with mitochondrial disease. We see it across all our neuromuscular patients. So and that's where MDUK have been really supportive for them. And I think the other factor is that we work closely with our charity partners to support patients, to say to patients, actually, go to these organizations. They will have information that you can provide to your employers. So information leaflets, because information is power. it helps them say, this is what I've got in a very clear way. These are the people that you talk to if you've got any questions.
And then we had a specific question which you touched on, I think in terms of describing the symptoms, but someone's asked in advance, how does mitochondrial disease impact on sort of metabolism and the metabolic system? So Natalie, if I go to you first, then maybe Nick, if there's anything as a physio you suggest about exercise to sort of help the metabolism. But yeah, Natalie, any comments from you?
That's a really good question, and I probably don't know the answer. I probably should know the answer, but I don't. I think it's individual, because mitochondrial disease affects all people affected in different ways, particularly if it's a maternally inherited. So if it's a mitochondrial gene defect, the defect can be in different organ systems. So you could have people with a normal metabolic rate and normal metabolism, so they'll eat food and metabolize normally and will have normal weight. Then you've got people who have difficulty gaining weight, so they're terribly underweight, the real low BMI people that really struggle to put on weight. And then you get people who will probably have a higher BMI, so gain more weight, largely because they cannot move as much, because they might have muscle weakness, or they might have severe fatigue, so they can't be as active as they can. So that's where the nutritional side comes in. I think that, I don't know if Nick's got any more to add. In fact, he'll probably have a lot more to add, because from the energy and exercise point of view.
Possibly not. I think
it's a tough question, isn't it?
Yeah, I think possibly the gut motility may be an issue.
Yeah.
That if you're moving your food through and it's not, even to digest food is energy inefficient. So we burn calories just trying to upregulate calories, just trying to get calories into our body, and that requires energy. And if you're not producing energy through mitochondria, then that means that you're struggling then to move the calories that you've taken through food into your body. Metabolic rate's an interesting one, and Chris Morse has done some research on patients, and actually metabolic rate doesn't change regardless of neuromuscular condition. It's almost like a set that we can't really change. But I do think that the issue is that as your muscles burn a huge amount of energy, and so if you start losing muscle bulk, you start losing lean tissue, then that means that you don't then your insulin buffering actually changes, and I think that might be an aspect to it as well, and alongside the diabetes. So your energy, your ability to be able to lay down lean tissue or fat, it's changed. But it is an interesting question. I'm not sure anybody's actually looked into it, but I'm going to have a little Google.
Could be a good project.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it's interesting. I really don't know. So I'm sort of like second guessing in a way.
Yeah, it might be a future project.
Yeah.
Something to look at.
Yeah, and someone in advance also asked us about the issue of sort of swallowing and food, and someone was just asking in the Q&A here about some of the sort of dietary steps they take. So is a dietitian a key part of the team that supports them with sort of mitochondrial disease? Do you work in partnership with dietitians and speech and language therapists, I guess, on swallowing as well?
Oh, absolutely. In the London team, we don't have a specific mitochondrial dietitian, but we work with the neuromuscular and metabolic dietitians quite closely. So our neurometabolic unit have a specific dietitian, so we'll link with them, particularly certain mutations will require particular diets. So we do work closely with them, and when our London patients come to our neuromuscular complex care ward, we'll often ask the dietitian to see them so that we can work out what their calorie protein requirements are. Speech and language therapy, enormous benefit of having them on the team, and getting patients assessed. Initially, we bring them to the neuromuscular ward, they'll get assessed and then have regular follow-up either locally or with our team. But yeah.
Unfortunately, we don't have all the luxuries of London. We have a dietitian who's more than happy to take referrals, and also our local speech and language we will refer if needed. But you know, it's always one of the questions that I would ask in clinic, in my own clinics, is I ask several questions, and one of them would be about choking on food or fluid. And if anybody says, yeah, but not very often, well, how often? Only like once every 2 or 3 days. That's enough to flag me up. Yeah, that's not normal. But people perceive it as normal because it's such a slow process to get to that point that, oh, I'm only choking a little bit, and I'll just take a little bit of a sip of water with the food, the bread or whatever, and it goes away. That's fine. But it's not fine because you have got a problem with your swallow. And the same with diet as well. We need to look at diet to optimize the diet to match the mitochondria, because as Andreas, we've established that there's certain conditions that need a specific targeted diet.
Yeah. The other thing is thinking about you know, one of the questions that I ask when I do telephone follow-up, because I'll do an annual review with patients, and I'll ask them, how long does it take to eat your meal? So if you're taking a long period of time, so average person will eat their dinner, so your main meal of the day, in about 20 minutes, unless you're having like 5 courses, which nobody can afford 5 courses of food. But most people will eat their meal within 20 minutes. So if you're taking more than 20 minutes to get through half or 3/4 of your food, then you clearly have some process problems, either with the chewing, the swallowing. You're losing energy. It's taking energy to eat in order to get the energy in. So that for me is also a bit of a red flag as well. So, you know, unintended weight loss is one of the questions I asked about. Coughing, choking, and how long does it take to eat your meal is a really good one.
Thank you. At the moment, we've got 2 questions left, unless any more come in on the Q&A, and I'm going to open this one also back out to Professor Horvath and Professor Gorman if they're still with us. So I had a question in the chat around, can alternative therapies like acupuncture and herbal remedies have any provide any support for people with mitochondrial, and is there any research around that? So I don't know if anyone would like to tell that first. I don't know, Natalie, in terms of as from a nurse perspective, do people use things like acupuncture? And then be interested to hear the views both on a research perspective but also as the clinician perspective from the professors.
I've had a couple of patients ask about acupuncture in the context of pain. Herbal, not so much really. You know, obviously people will go onto the internet and do searches and things, but I haven't had that many people come to me and go, oh, would this work? Mainly herbal things for sleep, like valerian, you know, but yeah.
And Nick, I left you out, but I had some physio unrelated to neuromuscular condition and had acupuncture as part of that. So, of course, is that something you regularly use with neuromuscular patients as well?
Yes, I've used it for a couple of patients with mitochondrial, and it's been a little bit beneficial. It's not been a complete resolution of their pain, but it's allowed them some relief and they've slept better. Whether it's a placebo or whether it's an actual has an actual physiological impact, we don't really know.
Great, thank you. And Professor Horvath or Professor Gorman, if you've got anything to add to this question.
I don't really have anything to add. I only regarding acupuncture, it's only I would mention the same what Nick and Natalie mentioned about the pain, and I have no information about herbal.
Yeah, I'm happy to add to that. So yeah, there is some evidence that acupuncture does work, just like Nick and Natalie have said, around for outside of mitochondrial disease, just generically for pain, particularly low back pain, neck pain. It's been quite successfully used also for migraine, and there is perhaps up to 20% of patients with mitochondrial conditions have migraine. So there are alternative things like acupuncture, Indian head massage have been shown to be of some benefit. With regards to herbal, I suppose I always add that little caveat just to be careful, because we don't know quite often, you know, a lot of these things can be bought on the internet. We're not really sure what the constituents are. And we have seen some adverse both liver and kidney effects due to some of these herbal supplements. And remember, it's not just what's in those, it's how they might interact with some of the medications that you're on. So we always strongly advise that when you see your health professional, that you just, you know, remind them, because quite often you say, you on anything? No, and then they bring out a list. It's really important we know everything that they're on, particularly from a herbal. And then a lot of us will ask, and where are you sourcing that from as well? So you just need to be that little bit careful, because a lot of these haven't undergone rigorous scientific testing for efficacy as conventional medication have.
And the final question I've got, I think may well be more for Professor Horvath, Professor Gorman, and it's been I think no is a fine answer to this, so apologies for the question, but we talked a lot about awareness of mitochondrial and the fact that there are patients living with the condition without realizing perhaps, and Nick spoke about the importance of being part of a specialist centre. Is there any estimate as to how many people might be sort of adrift from the support they need, or is that just a big unknown in terms of that unmet need at the moment?
I'm happy to attempt to address that. I wish I knew, Rob, because I think if we knew, there's definitely people adrift, because we're all seeing, you know, maybe they're under loads of different services, be it the diabetic service, the neuropathy service, the cardiomyopathy service, you know, there's so, you know, the epilepsy service, because it's so diverse, the liver service, the kidney failure service. I just need someone to think about it. So respectfully, you know, why we estimate 1 in 4,300, we know that work done at Cambridge with Patrick, it says perhaps 1 in 200 actually carry a faulty gene that might result in disease. We're way missing a lot of people. And I think the more and more awareness we're raising, the more and more we're seeing that there's a huge population of patients out there unaware and undiagnosed. And I think that's why all of us are here even this month. We're just champion for people to think about it. And what I always say is, you know, if you've got a young person who's dementing in their 30s and 40s, has an abnormal scan, think mitochondria. You know, if you've got someone who's diabetes and deafness, think mitochondria, the two things. So, you know, if it doesn't fit, you know, you know, respectfully, we have clinicians phoning in and there's this huge list of differentials, and quite often we just don't get on the list, and we think, but we should be way up there before they're weird and wonderful. If we could change and effective that they just thought about it and then reach out to us all for advice or help, that's what we're all here for. And all of us around the United Kingdom, highly specialized services, research groups, Rita's team, London with Natalie and Oxford, we're all available. You know, we don't mind anyone contacting us even outside of ours if they think about it. So it's really, again, back to that point, raising awareness and thinking about it.
Thank you. That was a very comprehensive answer, and also a very good offer to others watching the seminar. So thank you. Any other comments on that question, or any final comments before I bring things to a close from any of the panelists? Well done, everybody. Thank you. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. I'll bring us to a close there. Thank you so much to our panel. That was a fantastic, wide-ranging discussion covering a lot of areas. So thank you very much indeed. A reminder that our helpline and information service is available to everybody, and everyone affected with a muscle wasting condition, and the details are on the screen now. Thank you again to our sponsors, PTC, and a reminder that the recording of this session and all other Muscle Matter sessions will be available on our website shortly, and we'll be in touch shortly again with a short survey to gather feedback. But thank you very much. I hope this has been a good start to the week for those who've been joining us, and enjoy the rest of the week, everybody. And thank you to our panelists once again. Thank you. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.